Hello, this is Jane Reid from True Crime Nightmare. I hope everybody had a good Christmas and a Happy New Year to everybody. This is episode 41 and this is the case of Melanie Road. Melanie Road was only 17 years old when she was murdered. Melanie had been out with her friends and her boyfriend in Bath, which is a city in England. It was the 8th of June of 1984. Melanie had just enjoyed a typical night out with friends, but unfortunately she ran into a murderer just a few yards from her family home. Earlier that day, Melanie had been dropped off by her parents in the centre of Bath. She had arranged to meet some of her friends as well as her boyfriend. The group went on to have drinks in a few of the local pubs before moving on to the local nightclubs in the area. According to statements made by Melanie's friends later, it had just been a very typical night out for all of them. They had been out in the city on many occasions before. Also, as well as was typical, the group would all go their separate ways at the end of the night. Melanie would walk the short distance home, the home that she shared with her family. She must have felt comfortable walking home in the early hours because she had apparently done this on many occasions before. Bath was and still is considered a relatively safe place, but unfortunately on that summer's night in 1984, someone noticed Melanie Road and proceeded to attack her with a knife. He also sexually assaulted her before leaving her for dead. Her body was left where it would very soon be discovered. She was only a few hundred metres from home. She was murdered in the early hours at about 1:30 in the morning. A few hours later, at about 5:30 in the morning, the local milkman and his 11-year-old son discovered Melanie's body and quickly raised the alarm. It must have been such a shock and so upsetting, particularly for the young boy, to have come across such a horrible, bloody scene. The boy had only gone out with his dad to help out, and it is believed that he was the first person to discover Melanie's body. Once the investigators and other professionals arrived, they very quickly sealed off the area. They also put a white tent up to protect the scene around Melanie's body in case it started to rain. It was also used to keep away prying eyes away from the scene because it was particularly bad that the murder happened in the middle of a street with homes all around the area overlooking the crime scene. It also helped to protect the poor victim's dignity, I would imagine. The investigators would soon discover that the trail of blood covered a quarter of a mile in distance. The police obviously needed to find out who the victim was very quickly. There was no identification on the body or in the immediate area, however. The police did, however, discover a wooden keyring which had the name Melanie carved into it, so they appeared to have a lead in regards to the victim's identity at least. Anyway, they had her first name, it would seem. Amazingly, and I really find this hard to believe, the police drove around the local area with a loudspeaker and called out "Melanie" over and over again. This got the attention of a woman who lived close by. The woman was Melanie Road's mother. She had heard the commotion and had stopped the police car to tell them that her daughter was called Melanie and that she had not come home from her night out. I find this approach shocking, and I have no doubt it would not happen this way today, but I'm really surprised it happened in 1984 as well. I understand that identifying a body is a priority, but surely there are much better ways of going about doing it than driving around the streets calling out the potential name of the murder victim. There were not many murders in Bath, and surely it would only have been a matter of time before the police would have a call from the parents reporting a missing daughter, and identification could have been made then in the usual way. I know that the police did not have any proper identification as such, but really, how many young girls were murdered in Bath? Not very many. I understand that the police officers could not find any identification at the scene either, or on the body of Melanie, but still it would have in all likelihood only taken a few hours to hear about a missing person from the local area, particularly as Melanie's mother was already concerned about her not returning from her night out. At the time of Melanie's murder, there was no such thing as a dedicated murder team as such in Bath, but they did apparently have CID officers as well as detectives and obviously police officers. They also drafted in police officers from Bristol to help out with the murder investigation. Understandably, the local people of Bath were extremely concerned that a murderer was on the loose. They were worried about not only their own safety but also the safety of their loved ones. They also wanted justice for Melanie Road. At the murder scene, the investigators found numerous spots of blood, not only at the actual scene where Melanie's body had been found, but also within a quarter of a mile of the actual crime scene itself. Some of the blood would turn out to be from the killer, who had presumably managed to get injured when he brutally killed Melanie. Swabs were taken of all the blood spots. There were over 80 blood spots in total. All of the swabs were then sent off to the lab to be analysed further. DNA was not available in 1984, but forensic analysis could determine blood group as well as other additional information which could become useful to the murder investigation. It took several days for the police to collect all of the evidence from the crime scene and from the wider area as well. Also, there were no computers around that could be used in any very useful way at this time. Any relevant information would have to be written down and cross-referenced by the investigators themselves, which would often take up a lot of their very valuable time, as you can imagine. Information would also have to be stored on a card index system, which would hopefully be of some use later on in the investigation. The investigating officers, despite their best efforts, were unable to find the actual murder weapon. They looked over a wide area, including in an area which had very long grass growing, which made the task very difficult indeed. The weapon has never been recovered. The pathologist who examined Melanie Road's body said that the murder weapon used had either been a knife or a screwdriver. The police would later conclude, after having interviewed all of those close to Melanie Road, that in all probability she had been killed by a stranger who had randomly chosen to attack her. Melanie Road had only just recently moved to Bath, but she had really settled in very well. They were very quickly. She had made plenty of new friends. She also had a newish boyfriend and a very loving and supportive family all around her, which included siblings as well as mum and dad. Melanie was also doing very well at school. She was due to take her A-levels, and it was expected that she would do well in them and that she had then planned to go on to university. She had been known by her teachers as a very good student. In the shocking aftermath of Melanie's brutal murder, the city of Bath was soon covered in posters asking the public for help in solving her murder. Despite all of the media attention, however, no credible suspect was identified at this point. There also did not appear to have been any witnesses that could add any credible or valuable information at this stage to the inquiry. The police, as well as members of Melanie's family, took part in many press conferences and public appeals, but not very much came of it. A couple of local people who had lived in the general area of where Melanie had been attacked remembered hearing a woman screaming. They also said that they had heard a man who had sounded distressed. No evidence was gained from this information, however. Unfortunately, Melanie Road's murder would eventually go cold. What was known about her murder and her murderer was very little. Melanie had been dropped off the evening before by her parents to meet up with her friends. She'd also managed to meet up with her boyfriend as well. After spending the evening together, all of them had gone home separately, it would seem, and Melanie had walked the last short distance towards her home by herself, as she typically did after an evening out in Bath. She had been attacked at about 1:30 in the morning of the 8th of June 1984. The attack, which had included a sexual assault and over 20 stab wounds, resulted in the 17-year-old dying just yards from her family home. Her body was discovered at about 5:30 that same morning. The police had dedicated a lot of manpower and other resources in the effort to try and find out who had killed the teenager. They had even arranged for adverts to be shown at local cinemas, asking for anyone with any information to come forward. It was known that Melanie had walked up Lansdowne Hill close to her home at about 1:30 in the morning, and this was just moments before she was attacked and killed. Blood grouping had been identified from the swabs that had been taken, but as of yet the actual DNA profile could not be established. The pathologist had determined that Melanie had not only been sexually assaulted, but she had sustained many stab wounds. Not all of them deep. Some could have been no more than little nicks to try and get her to move to where he wanted her to go, possibly. It was determined early on that Melanie and her killer had the same blood group, which was type A. However, it was also established that the killer had a rare protein component in his blood that only 3% of males have. The investigators established from the various blood spots that the killer ran away from the crime scene and that Melanie had put up a struggle which had injured him, which was made apparent by the trail of blood which had come from him as he had fled the scene. Obviously, he had somehow managed to sustain some sort of injury. The killer had vanished into nearby Hampton Crescent, which was where the blood trail had stopped. Despite over 1,000 calls from the general public and many samples taken from any likely suspects, no one was identified as being the killer. At this time, it would take decades to solve Melanie's murder, and it would involve the advancement of DNA to pinpoint her actual killer and to put him behind bars. This highlights the fact that with such groundbreaking gains in DNA technology, that a perpetrator can now not only get caught by leaving their own DNA material at the scene of the crime, but it can now be linked back to them even if they are not actually on the database themselves. This murder case was actually solved by using familial DNA. DNA can now often be linked due to it having resemblances in enough so-called pointers to any original DNA left at a crime scene. It sometimes only takes a family member to have their DNA registered for a criminal to be caught out. Sometimes the family member's DNA will have been entered because that person has either committed a crime or has actually entered it voluntarily through some of the websites now that are available for that sort of thing. Or they, like I said, they could have committed a crime and considered to be a potential suspect in a crime even, where their DNA has been taken and that could then be linked to somebody from the past. But sometimes a DNA match will come about because a family member has entered their details voluntarily to a company, like I said before, that deals with familial DNA. And as long as the original crime DNA sample has been preserved correctly and the so-called chain of command has not been broken in any way, the evidence can still be linked even after many decades. In the United Kingdom, there are no statute of limitations in serious crimes of any kind, so any suspect can still be charged and prosecuted even after such a long time, providing there is enough evidence to do so. Melanie Road's case went cold for over 10 years, and it was mainly due to these advances in DNA that more was able to be done to try and solve her murder and to hopefully identify the person responsible and to put him away for good. In 1995, the forensics team were able to generate a DNA profile from evidence found at the scene. This evidence was in the form of not only the blood that had been left, but also semen that had been recovered as well. Unfortunately, at this time, it did not give them a name because his DNA profile was not registered at that time in the database. Despite this, the police went about testing any persons of interest that had been identified over the years. Although the killer was not revealed, a few suspects could now be ruled out, which would eventually save a lot of time and other resources years later. It would ultimately take another 15 years when even more advances in DNA were made, and with the introduction of the familial DNA, that finally the police were able to make some progress in catching Melanie Road's killer. When the DNA sample was once again checked, a potential match was in fact identified. A woman who had her DNA uploaded to the system due to a very minor domestic violence incident provided a link to Melanie's killer. The woman had been involved in a domestic violence incident between herself and her boyfriend. Once a link was established, the police contacted the woman so that they could get more information on the close male relative that had been identified within the link of the two DNA profiles. This in turn led the police to a man called Christopher Hampton. Christopher Hampton had, at the time of Melanie's murder, lived only a few streets away, but he had since moved. Contact was made with Christopher Hampton by the police, who then asked him for a sample of his DNA. They explained to him why they wanted a sample and that it was voluntary. He agreed to give a sample there and then. The results would take many weeks to come through from the lab. However, the DNA did in fact match the profile that had been left at the murder scene. Christopher Hampton was in his 60s by now, and he was promptly arrested at his home in Bristol. He had been living in Bristol with his wife at the time of his arrest. Christopher Hampton had already prepared a statement that had been typed out. In the statement, he denied any involvement in the rape or murder of Melanie Road decades earlier. He was charged with her rape and murder and stood trial at Bristol Crown Court. Despite the fact that, as well as the statement he had previously given to police, he has subsequently answered all questions during police interviews with no comment. In the end, though, he did actually plead guilty to the rape and murder of Melanie Road, which must have been a relief to her family and friends. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and the judge said that he should die in prison. Melanie Road's killer was finally caught and put away. Her killer was Michael Hampton, 64 years old when he was finally caught, and 32 years old when he killed 17-year-old Melanie. He was born in Bath, and at the time of the murder he was living with his then partner, who had been pregnant at the time. He had been separated from his first wife at the time. He lived at Broad Street in Bath, which was on Melanie's route home the night that she died. At the time of the murder, he worked as a painter and decorator. He appeared to just carry on with his life afterwards as though nothing had happened. It was seen that no one suspected him of being a killer. He moved to Bristol, which is only 15 miles from Bath, in the 1990s. He split up from his partner and eventually married another woman. He had 4 children altogether from various relationships. He had 3 daughters and 1 son. There was no evidence that he had committed any other similar crimes either before or after he had murdered Melanie. He has always refused to talk about the murder or what had led up to it. The police believe that it was a crime of opportunity. This is a very sad case. The Road family had moved to Bath after spending years in various different places throughout the UK. Melanie's father worked for the Ministry of Defence. Melanie's mother was a very private person, but had always wanted justice for her daughter, but apparently she did not like the media attention at all. I think that this is totally understandable. After going through such a traumatic experience, it must be hard to function, let alone deal with the media as well. She did assist whenever she needed to, though, to help catch her daughter's killer over many years. Melanie Road was so young and had so much going for her, and it would appear that the attack on her was random. Her killer, it would seem, just happened to notice her that night, and presumably he had been having dark thoughts beforehand, which led to him brutally attacking Melanie. Although he hadn't been suspected of any other similar attacks, who really knows if it was an isolated attack or not? He obviously felt that his needs were more important than that of another innocent person. He lived for many years as a free man who probably thought that he had got away with murder. It must have been quite a shock when years later the police caught up with him, thanks to advancements in DNA. At least someone was brought to justice in the end, and he was taken off the streets to hopefully die in prison. Thank you very much for listening. Credits for this episode go to medium.com, ITV News, Catching Melanie's Killer at itv.com, bristolpost.co.uk. Thanks again. Bye.